Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth. I'm Trudy Stern, and if you care about Israel and America's role in the world, pay close attention to this episode because things are really shifting fast. The way the U.S. deals with its allies is changing, and that could have big consequences for Israel. Just recently, tensions between the U.S. and Ukraine reached a new level when President Trump kicked President Zelensky out of the Oval Office. Earlier that week, Vice President Vance gave a speech in Europe making it clear that America's focus may no longer be on supporting NATO the way it once did. What is Putin's message as he bombs Zelensky's hometown hours after Ukraine agrees to a ceasefire? And instead of US or Europe leading peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, those meetings are now happening in Saudi Arabia. What does all this mean? Is America moving away from Europe as its closest ally and focusing more on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states? Is President Trump's strategy to end the wars in the Middle East and Russia working? And how does all of this impact Israel? To help us break this down, we are honored to have Daniel Kochis with us today. Daniel is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, specializing in NATO, transatlantic security, and U.S. policy in Europe. His work has shaped policy discussions on NATO's future, US-Europe relations, and Russia's strategic influence. Kochis frequently provides expert analysis on geopolitical affairs, contributing to major publications and speaking at high-level conferences on security and defense issues. A lot is happening, and we're going to break it all down in a way that makes sense. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Judge Stern, thank you so much for having me on today, and it's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
Oh, it's great to have you. We have so much to cover. So to begin with, can you comment a little bit about NATO? Give us a little history. Tell us about it. We've all heard NATO, forever, but I think your expertise could really shed light on what NATO is all about.
Sure. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created in 1949 by 12 European countries plus Canada and the United States. So 12 total, 10 European, and then the two on the North Atlantic side. And so this was born out of the end of World War II. As you know, after the war, the Soviet Union really sort of took control of almost half of Europe. So Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic states were under Soviet dominion. And so the countries which were left in Western Europe were concerned about continued Soviet expansion, as was the United States. So there was this effort to create this organization which was really founded upon mutual security. So collective defense. If one country was attacked, then they were going to treat it essentially that they all were attacked, and it would bring the United States into defense of these countries, and it worked. You think about you didn't have any Soviet expansion after that time into these nations. There was also a values component of it. So when you read the treaty, they talk about the shared democratic values, respect for the rule of law, things like this. But essentially, it was really a security pact, which was successful, and it also allowed for the creation after the fact of the European Union, which didn't start out that way, but essentially the economic umbrella that Europe now really lives under.
Just as you're talking and explaining this, I just was wondering, how come Israel was never considered for NATO?
So there was a geographic limitation to the North Atlantic. So even things like Hawaii, for instance, is not technically covered by the Mutual Defense Clause of NATO's founding treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty. Same thing with the French territories, which are in the Pacific. So it was really a geographical limitation. And it was, I think, it was sort of came out of the era of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Western Europe. And so it started out very, very small. It was sort of, West Germany was really the frontier of it, and then up to Norway. And then it has expanded over time pretty significantly. So it started out with 12 founding members, and now you have 32 countries which are part of NATO. So it's expanded significantly.
So let's get right to the hotbed issue, which is the Ukraine-Russia war. Um, a lot of people believe that it happened because Europe was considering including Ukraine into NATO. But yeah, I think that's probably a more simple explanation for this war. So can you just, describe and tell us what really was the issues here?
So my view is that this war really is about Russian imperialism, right? The Russian desire and need under the Putin regime to have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and to expand itself. Russia cannot be an empire in their mind without Ukraine. There's historical reasons for this because I mean Kyiv long predates Moscow as a city. The religious connotation, both largely Orthodox countries, and so for Russia to lose Ukraine, they can't be an empire, and they want to control the country. And so the Putin regime was very concerned about the Democrat revolutions in the early 2010s in Ukraine, which threw out Russian aligned leadership within Ukraine, and so they moved then on a Western trajectory. And so for Ukraine, they've always wanted to have European Union membership and NATO membership. I think, quite frankly, it was unlikely to happen any in the near future. But the idea that you would have a country on the borders of Russia, which was democratic, secure, economically prosperous, I think for Putin was seen as destabilizing. And so I'll give you a very good example. When you look at the Baltic states, which are Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, so north of Ukraine, these countries are, when you look at where they were before they joined NATO, they joined NATO in the early 2000s, where they were economically before then and where they are now, it's night and day. And so the security that the alliance has brought there has allowed an economic flourishing. It's given investors confidence that their investments will be stable, that the country is stable. And so there's a huge disconnect in many ways between the Russian side of the border and the sort of Western side of the border in terms of the economic prosperity. And I think that a lot of Russians see that. There's still a lot of connections. People have relatives or friends that live on either side, and they know that life is much better in the sort of Western part. That is seen, I think, as destabilizing. And in Ukraine, I think that is particularly heightened, that sort of awareness. And so that, for me, this is all about regime stability. The NATO portion of it, I think, is just an excuse that the Russians use. I don't believe that Moscow really sees NATO as dangerous or as threatening. But I think that it's a useful sort of strawman that they put up domestically in order to justify their ongoing war.
So, how significant do you think the timing of the war was, that it happened under the Biden administration? And can you comment on, your thoughts, as well as, what the thoughts around the table are?
Well, the Russians, I think, have like a lot of our adversaries have a different timetable than we do, right? I mean, as you know, I mean, the news cycle in the United States moves on in like lightning speed, right? Especially in the last few months. And so I don't think that the timing was a coincidence. I think that the Russians are opportunistic, and they'll take advantage of whatever opening they have. So you think about this, in some ways, the sort of imperial drive for the Russians started under the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, right? He had this famous meeting with Putin where he said, I looked at the man in his eyes and, I saw someone I could deal with. In 2008, at the end of his term, the Russians invaded Georgia. That's still an ongoing conflict there. The Russians have seized territory, which they continue to hold. In 2014, under the the Obama administration, they first invaded Ukraine. So they seized Crimea, they annexed it, the peninsula, which was really important for their naval capabilities. And they seized parts of eastern Ukraine in the Donbass. Now this had come on the heels of the Biden administration's talking about pivoting to Asia, drawing down U.S. presence in Europe, and I think just general appeasement and weakness in the world, right? Their famous dictum of leading from behind, which makes no sense. You can't lead if you're leading if you're behind at the end of the line. And so nothing essentially happened. We sort of had this Minsk stalemate, which Minsk was the ceasefire agreement brokered by the Americans and the French and the Germans. And then the Biden administration comes in. They want to reset once again with the Russians. They come to an agreement with the Germans to allow for the increased Russian gas coming into Europe through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And I think that the Russians saw the Biden administration as weak, and again, another opportunity to continue what they had started originally in 2014. So I don't think the timing was a coincidence at all.
Okay, and as we go forward from that moment of weakness of the Biden administration till today, so as late as last night, so now we have President Trump in the White House with a very different flavor and feeling towards the war. President Biden had given Ukraine a lot of assistance, throughout the war, and now President Trump is committed to stopping the war, number one, and also he cut all of the aid to Ukraine. So they've been in ceasefire discussions, and Ukraine actually agreed to the ceasefire. And now we're hours later, and Putin attacks. And not only does he attack, but he attacked Zelensky's hometown. So what does that all mean? What do you see as really what's happening?
Well, I think that President Trump has the feeling, and I don't think he's wrong about this, that the Russians would have been much less likely to continue the war as they did in 2022 if he had been in office. So you can, in my view, you can draw a direct line between the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan under the Biden administration and the Russians' decision to invade. They saw how the Biden administration reacted, the way that they botched that, the lack of communication with allies. And so they said the US, this administration is weak. They're completely rudderless, and so it's an opportunity for us. I think that they would have thought twice had President Trump been in office about continuing to propagate the war. So I think that there's a bit of I don't know, bitterness is the right word, but just sort of annoyance that this is an issue that President Trump has to deal with. So he comes in, he has the campaign promise of ending the war. There's obviously been a huge death toll on both sides, terrible civilian suffering in Ukraine. And so the administration is trying to push towards a settlement. And so much of the focus in the, I think, early parts of the administration so far have been on getting the Ukrainians to agree to negotiate and to settle. And so that's why I think you've had a lot of the hardball tactics about cutting aid, cutting intel to the Ukrainians to try to get them to agree. And so we've had the recent announcement about that the Ukrainians have agreed to this 30-day ceasefire. And I think now the rubber is meeting the road because the Russians are really going to be the sticky wicket here. Getting the Ukrainians to agree, I think, was always going to be the easier part of the puzzle. The Russians, I don't think, actually want to have an agreement. That they don't want to end this war right now. And so barrage last night, the attacks on Zelensky's hometown, that I think was a pretty clear signal that the Russians are not really interested in this. And ultimately, I don't think that these negotiations are going to bear fruit.
Wow. Okay, so I don't think President Trump is a guy who likes to take no for an answer. So what do you foresee? What's your projection of what's going to happen here?
Well, I think that this is really the $100,000 question is what happens when the Russians don't actually want peace. And so I think part of it is going to be how the Russians play it. They're probably going to try to, go through with some sort of negotiation theater where they try to drag this out, and so they want to get to a point where they can essentially, if they come to any kind of agreement, it's going to be on their terms, right? And so they're trying to, they don't see this sort of battle space at the present moment as advantageous for them to come to an agreement. So this is why they're pressing so hard. So the Kursk region is the region of Russia, which the Ukrainians still have a small toehold in. And so the Russians have really been stepping up their attacks there. This is where the North Korean troops have been deployed. And they're trying to push the Ukrainians out right now because they don't want, if they have a ceasefire now, the Ukrainians essentially have a something to bring to the table to trade with the Russians for pieces of Ukraine, which the Russians continue to occupy. And so the Russians are trying really hard to push them out before they get to a ceasefire agreement. Um, and so, what does President Trump do if he comes to the conclusion that it's the Russians, not the Ukrainians, that are actually holding up his push for peace? Well, I think that he has a couple options. I think the one option could be that he becomes annoyed with them and he sort of writes them off and says, well, in that case, we're going to arm the Ukrainians, lift all these restrictions that the Biden administration had on about usage of American weapons, and whatnot, and try to actually support them and force the Russians to the table in a real way. The other option could be that the Russians are able to somehow go through with the negotiation theater to the point where the Ukrainians eventually get tired of it and sort of withdraw from the field, from the negotiation table, and then they're seen as the ones who are the problem here. And the third option would be that they sort of walk away, that the Americans say, well, we tried our best, the administration, we tried our best, and this is sort of an intractable problem that we can't, nobody here is ready for peace, and so we're just going to sort of wash our hands of it. It's Europe's problem. I think that's sort of the third option. Right now, it seems that the Russians are in a bit of a bind because the Ukrainians are saying that we're ready for the ceasefire, ready for peace, and the Russians clearly aren't. And so I think that's sort of where we are right now. But things are changing so rapidly. Think about where we were 2 weeks ago with the sort of White House blow up and where we are today. In 2 weeks, we could be in a much different place as well.
So if America um, doesn't support Ukraine in this war, and Europe is forced to do that, does Zelensky have enough to be able to withstand Russia?
I think yes. So look, the lack of U.S. Military support, but particularly intelligence support, does have a real impact for the Ukrainians. We saw, additional, I think, civilian deaths with Russian missile strikes over the last few days in the small period that the U.S. was withholding intel sharing. So um, the Europeans can step in a bit with intelligence, but not to the same degree that the U.S. can. Um, Same thing with, I think, military supplies. I mean, already over 50%, I think, of military equipment that the Ukrainians are using is domestically produced. So you think about drones. I mean, so much of this war now is sort of drone uh, tactics, and I mean, 80% of Russian frontline deaths are from drones, and most of those are produced by Ukraine themselves. The Europeans are trying to step in with additional funding and military equipment, but the U.S. provides certain capabilities, particularly sort of these long strike capabilities in terms of missile strikes and the targeting for those that I think are very difficult, especially in the short term, to sort of overcome if the U.S. isn't helping supply them. So, long story short, I think in the next 6 months, the Ukrainians would actually probably be in a pretty good place. I think that they would have to taper down a bit their offensives in the war if the U.S. were to permanently withdraw support. But I think that they probably could hold out for quite a long time, especially if the Europeans ramp up their production. Uh, but there are, I think, broader implications in terms of everybody is sort of watching, I think, the U.S. staying power and where the U.S. goes in terms of its engagement in Ukraine. I think that has implications for other theaters as well. I think it's very important for Israel and for the ongoing war against Hamas and the U.S. staying power to support there. And I think it's important for China. So our allies in Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines are also watching this because they're obviously very concerned about Chinese intentions. And Beijing is also watching this very closely to see, is the U.S. going to sort of hold out here? What kind of peace arrangement are they able to get with Moscow? So I think that there are broader implications here as well, but the immediate issue is that I think the Ukrainians without the Americans could hold on honestly and continue this war, just not as effectively.
So, for those of you who are joining late, we are speaking with Daniel Kochis, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, specializing in NATO, transatlantic security, and U.S. policy in Europe. So, Daniel, you mentioned a lot of different theaters that are paying close attention. That is very troubling. I mean, it almost sounds like World War III. It really does. Do you feel that we are at this precipice? Do you feel that this is a very tenuous moment in our history?
I think it's a fulcrum in history for sure. I don't think that we're sort of at a World War III moment. I think that the Russians, for instance, still respect NATO's Article 5, so the collective defense security guarantee. I mean, they're probing with a sort of shadow war of the West, and there's sabotage and assassin, these kind of things. But in terms of a real conventional military attack on an actual NATO member state, they haven't ever taken that step. And I think that they still believe in the power of NATO. And the U.S. has, under the Trump administration, has remained committed. Just yesterday, or this morning, the U.S. flew a bomber over Stockholm, so the newest member of NATO. And they did this just a few weeks ago on Estonia's Independence Day. So the U.S., I think, is messaging to the Russians that we are still very much committed to the NATO alliance. And I think that the Russians respect that. But I will also say that all of these adversaries, so you're talking about the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, they're working together now in a way that we haven't ever seen in the past. So, the Russians employ heavily Iranian Shahed drones, right? There is a drone factory that the Iranians helped the Russians set up inside Russia. The Russians, in turn, are supplying the Iranians with intel, with support for their own ballistic missile program. The Chinese are obviously the key enabler of the Russian war. North Korea is supplying troops to Russia in Kursk. The Russians are helping North Korea with their nuclear program. So all of these things I think are connected in a way that we haven't seen. And so in that respect, there's nothing really stovepipes in the same way now. Everything, what happens in the Middle East impacts what happens in the Indo-Pacific, what happens to Europe. I mean, the October 7th attacks, I believe, happened on Putin's birthday. I mean, to me, that wasn't a coincidence, right? And so the Russians at the moment were under immense pressure in the war on the battlefield. And so this was a way, in some ways, to distract the U.S. by wanting to come to aid its ally in Israel, uh, it sort of took their eye off of what was going on in Ukraine, and so that was advantageous to Russia. And so
And
I think that the
I just think
Iranians,
that on
yeah,
this show, we have interviewed a lot of people and
yeah.
nobody has made that connection. And that is really shocking. So October 7th is Putin's birthday. And
I
wow,
believe that is
wow.
correct. Or it's in that neighborhood. But the broader point was that the the Russians were in, I think were being pressed pretty hard at that moment, and so they needed some sort of relief. And the Iranians, I think, in some ways, the timing of this attack on Israel was not a coincidence because it was advantageous to the Russians as well. And so all of these things are interconnected in my view. And so it's really, you have to sort of look at the broader implications of what is happening here. And so, even in terms of, I think another really interesting component, Trudy, of the peace negotiations that the Americans are pressing for is what is the role of China? Right? I mean, China sort of wants a role in any kind of future settlement. I think that they actually want the war to continue because it's good. It bleeds both the Americans and the Russians, who are an ally, but only sort of somewhat so. But they want a piece of the action as well. So it's a really interesting time, but also I think a pretty dangerous one as well.
Well, it's also China probably enjoys the distraction away from China, and whatever malign things China is engaging in right now.
That I think that's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things they've been doing in the past month is they have been sort of circling the Australians with naval vessels. And so they have this ring of Chinese warships, which are essentially, sailing around Australia. And then they'll kind of peek into the exclusive economic zone of Australia, and then they'll pop back out. And so it's sort of a probing activity. It's a pressure activity on Australia, which is obviously a Western ally, but it's also a country with a pretty relatively small population, and also a country that would like to rebuild its military capabilities a bit. So, yeah, I think that they enjoy the distraction. I mean, the U.S. can't be everywhere at one time, and there are real threats to all of our allies, to Israel, to Ukraine, to the Europeans, to our friends in the Indo-Pacific. And we don't have the same resources and capabilities that we did 30 years ago vis-a-vis our adversaries to address them all.
Very, very frightening times. So let's talk about another topic, and that is Trump's foreign policy shift. Is President Trump reprioritizing U.S. global alliances, moving away from traditional European partners, and toward the Gulf? So, for example, right now the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are happening in Saudi Arabia, as opposed to what one would think is in Europe. So can you talk about those broader implications? Do you think that this is a pivot? Do you think that this is a change? What are your thoughts here?
Well, I think the administration is more open to different forms of engagement clearly than previous U.S. administrations. So, um, in some ways, I think that's really advantageous. They're not boxed into sort of traditional precepts. I mean, so when Biden administration came in, the way that they sort of approached the world was through Brussels, through the headquarters of the European Union, through traditional capitals, Paris, Berlin. This administration, I think, views things a bit differently. And so they're much more open to engagement, say, with the Saudis, right? They have a pretty good relationship there, which is obviously a much more difficult relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia under the Biden administration. Europe will, I think, always remain important in the United States. One, because of the economic connections, most of our foreign direct investment comes from Europe. 48 states trade more with Europe than China. I mean, there's huge trade flows. People are flying back and forth. And I think that security-wise, that's sort of the foundation of U.S. security. But this administration is not necessarily wedded to needing to do, say, this negotiation um, with the Europeans as the sort of foundational partner in that. So they'll say, well, we'll work with the Saudis, right? The Russians will go there. We have a good relationship with them, and so they could be sort of a neutral arbiter for us and a site for these negotiations. So they do approach things, I think, differently, and so there's good and bad things about that. But yeah, so that's what I'd say. And I did just confirm that Putin's birthday is October 7th. So
Okay, terrific. What a great commentary.
yeah, really.
So, okay, so how does Israel fit into this new U.S. alignment? As the United States strengthens its ties with Saudi Arabia, so does Israel actually under the Abraham Accords framework. So, I mean, is this just you know, an expansion of the world? Like since we've now we see the world as a global a new global place. It's not 30 years ago where there was restricted airplane travel and there was no internet and there was, a more limited interaction with the world. Now the world is a very global place. So do you think that's just what's happening here, or do you think it's a total shift and move of the sphere of influence? And how does that impact Israel?
Yeah, I mean, obviously things are so interconnected now. The U.S., I think under the Trump presidency, the first and second time around, is has opened possibilities, and obviously the Saudi-Israel, the Abraham Accords, I think that really sort of are expand our horizons in terms of what is possible. The difficulty in the region is going to be the Iranian question. We've had sort of this detente in 2023 between the Saudis and the Iranians, and that doesn't necessarily align with the way that the Trump administration approaches Iran, and obviously the way that Israel is thinking about Iran, to say the least. So I think that is going to be a bit of a friction point between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. and the Gulf states as well, and probably also between Israel and those countries. So that there's still a lot to be said about areas where things could go awry. We had talked, Trudy, before a bit about the Turkey angle too, and so that I think is also really interesting. And so the changeover in Syria, which has just happened, is I think a really fascinating thing to look at when you think about obviously Israel's security interests there. Turkey is obviously is a huge player in Syria, and the Russians too are also here, right? So the Russians initially were sort of kicked out of Syria by the new government, and now they're trying to get back in. So they had an air base there with Assad and a very important naval base that they're trying to negotiate with now with the government in Damascus for re-access to. So there's a lot at stake here, and things are changing so rapidly, and it's really going to be interesting to see how things play out. And I think that this is part of why Erdogan is trying to block Israel from having, for instance, working in the NATO exercises upcoming in Bulgaria, is that they're, I think, a bit annoyed about Israel's engagement in Syria and Israel's position there because they want to sort of be the big player. So I think that that's part of what's going on there.
Do you think that that Turkey is basically up for grabs? They're a NATO country, but they sort of align in terms of their bad acting with Iran, China, and I mean, we know that they don't get along with Iran, but their objectives seem very similar to Iran, Russia, China, to that axis of evil. So, what do you think? What do you see happening with Turkey and where they go with all of their malign activities?
Turkey is a NATO member. They, had joined the alliance in the 50s. And the reason that they were brought in was really because of the strategic location. sort of astride the Middle East, Indo-Pacific, and Europe. But they've always been difficult for the alliance, and so the thought has always been it's better to have them inside the tent causing problems, but still sort of on our side, than outside the tent causing problems and being more aligned with our adversaries, with the Soviets at the time, now the Russians. And that has remained true to this day. You think about the difficulty that Turkey has been, for instance, the U.S. has an important air base there where we store nuclear weapons, and there's been talk about kicking the U.S. out in the past. It's died down, but in the recent past, that's happened. Uh, of course, the Europeans have a very difficult relationship with Turkey in terms of migration and this sort of, they're essentially paying the Turks to keep migrants from spilling over once again over the border into Europe. So that's a very difficult component of this. And the Turks are, they sort of triangulate between the West, the collective West, Europe, Israel, and the Russians, the Chinese, to try to maximize their advantage there. And they don't have even a great relationship necessarily with the Russians. I mean, it was just a few years ago that the Turks shot down a Russian fighter jet, which was over their airspace, and the Russians essentially made a big huff about it. They didn't do anything. So I think that that's going to continue to be a really important but difficult relationship for the United States to try to thread the needle on in terms of what's going on in Turkey. And Turkey isn't a monolith either in terms of their leadership under Erdogan, and then sort of the more democratic elements which have which are still exist in the country. And you saw that, I think, with the elections last year in Istanbul, where the opposition won. Um, but it's, I think, a really fascinating relationship to continue to keep an eye on.
So you've brought up so many fascinating but troubling topics, and thoughts, actually. One that I can't stop thinking about, since you brought up October 7th being Putin's birthday, is that these malign actors who are closely aligned with their objectives, China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, that they have no problem strategizing together and creating these distractions. So we know Russia's distraction is with Ukraine, Iran's distraction, and I don't know if it's really only a distraction so much as a spreading the resources amongst a lot of different places. Uh, China, I mean, one could say that it started with the pandemic, if you believe that, and which I do. And what is their next move? Are they going to invade Taiwan? Are they going to do something in Australia? And how are they going to be bolstered by these other very malign actors? And North Korea, what are they waiting for? So it just seems like we are in very tumultuous times, and our president, while very strong, um, very difficult road ahead, it seems. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think there are significant challenges that we and our friends overseas are facing, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about all of these all of these adversaries, which have slightly different angles or interests that they're trying to pursue, but they're all sort of have agreed to work together. And so, when you think about Israel, I wouldn't call it a good relationship, but they had a decent relationship with Russia in the past, right? There was a big tourism flow, and they sort of kept decent relations with Moscow. But now you have the Russians actively aiding Iran with their ballistic missile program and the like. And so you think about that is an existential threat to the state of Israel. And so now, that is of course impacted their relationship with Russia. And so that's true of all of these adversaries. They're all sort of helping each other. Um, and that's creating some friction points between them, but they're all sort of trying to use this sort of Axis alliance, for lack of a better term, to find opportunities to advance their own interests. And so, the North Koreans, what do they want? Well, they want a workable nuclear program and more importantly, platforms to be able, so ballistic missiles to be able to, send those nuclear weapons elsewhere, right? To be able to use them, and the Russians have that. And they also get some experience for their special forces, actual battle experience in Ukraine. So that for them is a good thing. Um, the Chinese are making a lot of money off of the war. They're selling things to the Russians. They're also selling things to the Ukrainians as well, but to a lesser extent. They're buying Russian oil at a huge discount, which is great for their economy. And they're able to sort of bleed the West, right? The US and the Europeans are sending all of their equipment to help the Ukrainians, and the Russians, who they don't really like all that much anyway, even though they're sort of a nominal ally, are also losing, almost 1 million men now in the war. And so the Russians, of course, need the Iranian drones. They need Chinese to buy their energy and to supply them with um, all these different components for their military. So they need the Chinese as well. And the Iranians, okay, this is great for them. They're getting Western help for their ballistic missile program to the Russians. They're getting capital flows inward, and they're able to export their drone program elsewhere. And of course, that's not even to talk about sort of diplomatic support that they're all giving each other in international forum and whatnot. So they're all sort of working together. And so the point, I think, the broader point is that because the U.S. does, frankly, have limited resources compared to where we were 30 years ago, uh, we need our allies, and we need all to essentially sort of be singing off of relatively the same song sheet. So the Europeans, Israel, Japan, Australia. I mean, I think that I at least grew up with the mindset that this was sort of the way that the world was going to go. And I think that the reality is that there is an alternative which is very strong and which is sort of working together. And so we, as the collective West, need to also be working together to try to help each other, to push back against all of these adversaries as well.
So, final question before we have to say goodnight to you. But final question is: so, do you believe that President Trump's position on not aiding Ukraine in the way that we have under the Biden administration and forcing the Europeans to step up in a bigger way, do you think that in light of what you have just said about us all working together, do you think that was a correct thing to do, or not?
I think that cutting the Ukrainians off from intelligence in particular and from US weapons is a mistake. I mean, my view is that the Russians aren't serious about peace. And so we need to be providing Ukraine with everything we can in order to inflict a strategic loss on the Russians and force them into a settlement that they don't want to make. Now, having said that, the way that we were doing things under the Biden administration was very half-hearted. So yes, they provided a lot of aid and they provided a lot of weapons, but they also put huge restrictions on the Ukrainians in terms of their ability to use these weapons. There were reports when the Ukrainians had a very successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv about 6 months into the war, that the U.S. administration went to them and said, you have to basically pull back, and we're going to sort of staunch the flow of things to you because we're really worried about what's going to happen if you break out and the Russians are on the run in a bad way. So the Biden administration policy was sort of this stalemate. We're going to give the Ukrainians just enough not to lose, but we're not going to give them enough to win either because we're so worried about what the Russians are going to do. And so that is a recipe for endless war as well. So that wasn't really the solution either. So shaking things up isn't necessarily a bad thing. And the way that the administration, I think, is thinking about NATO isn't necessarily a bad thing either. I mean, there is a lot of truth in the fact that Europeans have sat back and not invested in the way that they should. That has changed significantly since 2022 because the threat perception in Europe is real. But I think that there is some value in the Trump administration's approach in terms of getting Europe to step up and actually do the hard political thing and put money into defense versus into other priorities. But we should also not be naive that the US is going to be able to completely disengage right away. I mean, the US has capabilities and Europe is going to remain important. So the US, I think, has an interest in staying involved there. And so I don't like necessarily the way that the administration goes about talking with Europe and sort of seeing it as much more transactional. But there is some value in forcing Europe to do more. And we've seen that with the new conservative government in Germany is saying that they're going to invest significantly, not just in buying planes and tanks and whatnot, but also in terms of building up their own infrastructure. Because if there is a war at NATO, you're going to need Germany to be sort of the locus, the infrastructure locus to get tanks. So you need something like just something as simple as German bridges can't have the weight of a tank on them, right? Or they'll collapse. So you need to rebuild them in a way that's going to allow that material to flow west to east in terms of war. And so that is really important. And in that sense, it has already been a success in terms of the way the administration has approached things.
Well, you have really been so unbelievably helpful in understanding all that's going on in the geopolitical scene. Daniel, I want to thank you for joining us tonight and for helping us break down the complicated and ever-changing global landscape. From NATO's shifting dynamics to America's evolving alliances and the growing threats from Iran, China, and Russia, your insights tonight have given us so much to think about, and we truly appreciate your expertise and the clarity that you bring to these critical issues. And we truly hope that you will come back to Nothing But the Truth and help us unpack the future issues that we see. To my listeners, thank you for tuning in and being part of the conversation. Make sure to tune in every Thursday night at 9:30 for another episode of Nothing But the Truth. If you missed any part of tonight's show or want to catch up on past episodes, you can find them wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Trudy Stern. Truth matters. Freedom depends on it. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.